Hi, right, so in this video we're going to talk about meaning, use and form. These are three concepts that are very useful for teachers to understand, especially in terms of grammar teaching. Okay, so before we get into that, have a look at this example. You can see a picture here of two medics and one very sick gentleman on the floor, and the medic asks him, "How are you doing?" Okay, and he answers, "I'm fine, thanks. And you?" Okay, so is this a good place? Is this a good time to be using this kind of response? No. Okay, so you can see that language exists within context. Okay, we learn when we're learning language, we learn these kind of stock or structured question and response examples. Okay, but there's more to language than that. Okay, so that's kind of related to meaning, use, and form, and understanding that just because something seems correct, that isn't really the way that we should always use it. Okay, all right. So let's get into meaning, use, and form. Okay, this is very useful for teaching vocabulary. Because this is relevant for vocabulary, but also grammar. Okay, really useful for grammar. So all language has these three different aspects. We can look at language in these three different ways. Okay, so let's start with meaning. What does it mean? Okay, what is the meaning of the word? What is the meaning of the expression or the grammar? Okay, so what does it mean? Next, use. Okay, this involves context. Okay, so when is it used and why is it used? And we looked at the example on the previous slide. You can see that context is quite important. Okay, and the final one here is form, which means grammar. Okay, so how is the language formed? What is the structure of the language? Okay, so all language can be analysed and also taught in terms of these three different aspects. I believe this was developed by Diane Larson Freeman, who is a big name in TESOL. Okay, so before we move on, have a think about what is the correct order that the teacher or the classroom, the learners, what is the correct order that the learners should be dealing with this? Okay, where should they start? Should they start with grammar? Should they start with meaning? Or should they start with use? Okay, well, the answer is most people suggest that meaning would be the beginning. Okay, so when we're introducing new words and new expressions, meaning is the most important thing to focus on at first. Okay, so yeah, the reason is that if we don't know what it means, then use and form is kind of irrelevant, right? If we're just learning some expressions and we haven't learnt the meaning yet, then it's kind of meaningless. Okay, okay, so yeah, meaning should be your first focus. Okay, so what should be next, form or use? Okay, well, now there is some disagreement about this, and there are arguments for form being second, and there are arguments for use being second. Okay, and I think that different situations might call for different kind of approaches or techniques to teaching grammar, but this concept is from Diane Larson Freeman, so let's go according to her suggestion, which is that use should be second. Okay, so according to Larson Freeman, use should be the second part of your focus. So when is it used? Why is it used? Context of use. Okay, so that would mean that form would be third. Okay, so form focus, focus on structure would be the third part. Okay, so according to this, meaning, use, and form, this is known as the MUF framework, meaning, use, and form. Okay, now there are, as I mentioned, there are other ideas. Some people say meaning, form, and then use. And there are other ways of looking at grammar, grammar teaching. But I think that still, even if you subscribe to a different way of teaching, understanding these three aspects is really useful. So yeah, I hope this video is going to be useful. All right, so let's have a look at some examples of this. I want to show some examples that help you to kind of decipher and to pull apart this concept of MUF, okay, looking at these different aspects of language. Okay, so here's the first example. Here are two expressions. Can you play the piano? Can you open the window? Okay, so have a look at these two examples. How is the meaning of these sentences different? Okay. Also, what is the use situation or the purpose of using these expressions? Okay, well, can you play the piano is probably usually asked as a question of your ability, okay? Asking whether you have the skill of playing the piano. Okay, so that's asking about ability. Can you open the window? What is this? Is this asking about skill or ability? No. Okay, so this is probably a request, okay? It's a request to open the window. Now, interesting thing, the first one could be a request in certain situations. If we were both standing next to a piano and I pointed to the piano and asked, can you play the piano? That could be a request, okay? So context and situation does make a difference, but usually can you play the piano is a question about skill or ability. Okay, so you can see that the meaning and the use are different. Is the form of these sentences different or the same? Have a look at the form, okay? So they both start with can you, verb, the, noun. So the form is the same, okay? So the form is the same here, but the meaning and the use are different, okay? So that's interesting. Sentences that have the same form can have different use and meaning. Okay, so that helps us to understand that form is not everything. Okay, grammar doesn't tell us the whole story. Okay, the context of use is also really important. Right, let's move on. Okay, now this is a bit of a funny one. Okay, so these two expressions, these are British idioms that mean good or amazing. Okay. So have a look at these. These are idiomatic expressions, kind of slang, kind of. The first one, the dogs. Okay, now I've put a little star there because that's actually a bit of a rude word. And the second one, the bee's knees. Okay, now don't worry if you've never heard of these expressions. These are very colloquial British expressions. I don't expect you to know them, so that's why I'm explaining. They are idioms and they mean good or amazing. Okay, now notice that the form is the same and the meaning is the same. So have a look. The animal's body part. Okay, that's a body part. Okay, so the form or the structure of these sentences is the same. The meaning is also the same. Okay, they both mean good or amazing. However, one of these is rude, the first one, and should not be used in polite settings. This means the use is different. Okay, so the meaning is the same, the form is the same, but the use is different. In this case, it's related to register or formal and informal. Okay, now the bee's knees is something my mother would say in England, like if she went to a birthday party or she had a good time somewhere, she would say, oh, it was the bee's knees, and that just means it's really good. Okay, but my mother wouldn't say the first one. Okay, the first one is something you might say with your friends in the pub, when you're just kind of hanging out drinking or something. Okay, so you can see here that the register is different. That means the use is different, even though the meaning and the form are the same. Okay, let's move on to the final one. Okay, now this one's quite an easy one to understand. Okay, so have a look at these two sentences. What's the time is the first sentence, and Do you mind telling me the time? Okay. Now, according to the MUF framework, how are these expressions the same and different? Have a look. Okay. So, actually, let's work backwards. Okay, is the form the same? Okay, is the form of these two sentences the same? No, of course not. The form is very, very different. I mean, I think the only similarity is the time at the end, and they're both questions. Okay, but apart from that, the form is very different. Okay, use. How about use? Is the use the same or different? Okay, well, think about this carefully. What's the time? Do you mind telling me the time? Okay, the use here is actually a little bit different. Okay, so the first one is very casual, maybe with your friend, you know, with somebody you know well, or your child, or something like that. Okay, the second one, when would we use this expression? Do you mind telling me? Okay, a bit more of a formal expression. So the second one would be used in more formal situations. So the use is different. Okay, how about the meaning? Okay, what's the meaning of this? Okay, well, the meaning is the same. Okay, the meaning is, please tell me the time. Okay, the meaning is the same. So the meaning is the same, the use is different, and the form is different. Okay, so I hope those examples helped you to understand that analyzing and looking at language in different ways, according to MUF, can be really useful. Okay, so we're going to look at some more examples now. Now we're going to move on to vocabulary, because vocabulary also has meaning and use and form. I've just got a few examples just to give you some ideas about this, but you know, really this is quite a big topic, so I might make another video about this. Okay, so the meaning of words. Have a look at these words here on the slide. What do these words mean? Okay, and can you think of a homonym? Or actually an antonym would be better to ask for here. Okay, so crane is the first one. Okay, and I've given you some picture examples here. So crane has two different meanings. There's crane for a construction site and crane the animal. Okay, the second one is date. Okay, a date has two meanings. Okay, there is a kind of romantic date, and there's also a date which is a dried fruit. Okay, now all of these words have two different meanings: engaged, foil, leaves, net, point, right, rose, and type. Okay, so all of these words, the form is the same, the form of the word, the spelling of the word, but the meaning of these words are different. So then, of course, the use is different. Some of these are verbs and nouns. Okay, for example, date. Date can be used as a verb, but as a noun it can mean the dried fruit. Okay, so the use case could be different. Okay, so sticking with vocabulary, have a look at this. This is related to the use of words. So what comes to mind when you think of the word homeless? Have a think about that word. What do you think about when you hear the word homeless? Okay, well, this is kind of like a stereotype or the connotation of a word. Okay, this is quite a big part of teaching vocabulary, especially to higher level advanced learners. They need to know the connotation of vocabulary. But when you use the word homeless, you're probably going to think of something like this: somebody who lives on the street, somebody who's poor, somebody who, has to carry their belongings with them, perhaps begging for food. Okay, so it does have a kind of like a kind of connotation of being poor, and so on. Okay, so that's kind of the usual usage or connotation of homeless, but I want to show you another example. Homeless. Okay, so there are many tornadoes, and often tornadoes can damage homes, and people have to move out of those homes and maybe live in other temporary accommodation if there's a natural disaster. So those people are also homeless, okay? So when we hear the word homeless, we think of the stereotype of a homeless person, but the literal meaning of homeless just means without a home, okay? So yeah, that gives you an idea that the use of words and the kind of hidden meanings of words can change. Okay, now if we're going to look at the form of words, this could include something like this: prefix, suffix, and base word or root word. Okay. Now, knowing these can be very helpful with guessing the meaning of new words. This is actually, I think this is a really useful thing to teach, especially middle school and high school students, those students that are kind of intermediate level. Their vocabulary is really developing and they have to kind of learn or come across quite difficult new words. So explicitly teaching or drawing attention to prefix and suffix is really useful in teaching. You can do this when you have reading material, for example. Okay, so there's some examples here of prefix, root word, and suffix, some common prefixes and some common suffixes. Okay, so uncomfortable, the root word is comfort. Irregularly, the root word is regular. Disorganized, okay, you can see the root word in the middle. Unconfidently and disrespectfully. Okay, so a lot of English words, especially English words with Latin origin, do follow these common rules using prefixes and suffixes. And understanding that base words can be transformed into other words is really useful for helping learners' vocabulary develop. Okay, so I would suggest when you're teaching, think about explicitly drawing students' attention and maybe doing little mini lessons on the form of vocabulary, because getting students to notice the form of words can be really helpful. Okay. Okay, so we've looked at some examples of meaning, use, and form in terms of grammar and in terms of vocabulary. Now let's have a look at what this means for teachers. Okay, so meaning, use, and form is good for analysing language, but it's also good for thinking about how we're going to teach language. Okay, so let's start with meaning. How can we express meaning? So let's say we are introducing some new words or some new expressions that maybe the learners haven't learned yet. First thing we need to do is express the meaning of these words or expressions, okay? Learners need to know what it means first. Okay, so here are some suggestions. First, make the context clear, okay? So context of use helps us to understand the meaning. We can use images, photos, diagrams, video, mime, dialogue, and examples. Okay, so here are some suggestions about how to express the meaning of new language. Now, I would suggest use as many of these as possible. Okay, I think just one is probably not enough. So, use a video and a diagram, for example, or image and dialogue. Okay. So yeah, think about how you can express the meaning of the word. Okay, next, according to MUF, we should go to use. Okay, so how are we going to get students using these new expressions? Well, the most, probably the easiest thing of thinking about communicative activities is CLT, Communicative Language Teaching. This gives us lots of ideas about the kind of communicative speaking activities that are useful and effective. So things like information gap is really useful, information transfer, jigsaw reading with jigsaw discussion, survey activity, discussion and debate, sharing opinions, and problem solving. So these are just some quite common communicative activities, just some examples here. So here you want to get students using the language as much as possible after you've given the examples. Okay. So later on now, according to MUF, then you can focus on form, okay? Now, the suggestion with form is you shouldn't need to explicitly teach form. If you look at examples and give enough scaffolding and let learners practice those examples, they should be able to identify form and kind of internalize form. So when you move on to the form stage, rather than explicitly explaining, which is not good for grammar teaching, really, rather than doing that, you can give learners tasks where the learner's attention is focused on the form and they are working with the structure of grammar. So there's different ways of doing this. These are related to conscious raising or noticing tasks. Okay, so identifying the form, for example, reading a newspaper article and finding examples of passive, for example. Judging form, okay, judging, for example, correctness. Completing, this is really good, giving half of a sentence and having students finishing the sentence. Modifying or changing sentences. Sorting and organizing. Matching, for example, matching two halves or matching sentences that have similar form or different form. Okay, and also rule provision, guessing a rule. So you might give some examples and have students guessing why these examples are this and these examples are something else. Okay, so getting students to guess the rule. Doing this is actually a lot more powerful than the teacher explaining the rule. So if the students find the rule for themselves, they're more likely to remember the rule than just listening to a teacher explain. Okay, so I took this list actually from a paper by Cho Sojung from online. You can see the link there. But yeah, these are some general types of form-focused activities. Okay, student-centered, form-focused activities. All right, let's move on. Okay, so we've looked at what it means for teachers, MUF. Now let's have a look at this in a grammar lesson. Okay, so here's an example of a grammar lesson for, this is frequency adverbs. So in this lesson, we're teaching and practicing frequency adverbs. Okay, now according to MUF, we should start with meaning, and then use, and then form. So the grammar part of this lesson, or the grammar scaffolding, should go through these three stages. Okay, so we're going to start with meaning. Now, when we introduce the frequency adverbs, first we need to help students to understand what these words mean. Now, I've given two examples here of how to do this. You could use a calendar with Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and so on, with days of the week. And you could give various calendars, some with no checks, which is never, and then some with every day checked, which is always. Okay, so a calendar is quite a nice way of expressing the meaning of frequency. You could also use this gradient that goes from 0% to 100%. 100% is always, 0% is never, sometimes is somewhere in the middle, and then you could plot the words on here. And with this gradient, you could give some examples and put the examples on the right parts of the gradient. Okay, so those are two examples of expressing meaning. You could also, use some visual pictures as well, but I just wanted to squeeze all of this onto one slide. Okay, so next we're going to move on to use. Okay, so make sure before students use the language that they've heard and seen enough examples. So you need to scaffold the use. Okay, don't just throw them straight into using expressions that you haven't really scaffolded properly. Okay, so once you've given enough examples, you can set up this survey activity and students go around the room. Maybe they could have the questions written on a worksheet, for example, and they have to share and ask each other, how often do you blah, blah, blah. Okay, and they answer, I always do my homework, and they check on the survey. I never play computer games, and they have to check like this or write the student's name. Okay, so that's a survey activity, that's a communicative activity. Now, according to MUF, we should then focus on the form, okay? Students have had lots of examples, they've had some practice time, they should have learned the form of these sentences. Now I've put the form in the bottom here in a box, and you can see the 4 parts of the sentence, the structure of the sentence. But this is not how you should present it to the students, okay? That's just for the teacher. What kind of activities could check students understand the form of these sentences? Well, I've given a couple of examples here. You could use a gap fill activity or fill in the blanks. Fill in the blanks is actually quite useful for teaching grammar, especially if it's designed in a way to check that students know which words fit where into the sentence. So yeah, gap fill activities are, I think, quite suitable for form checking. You could also do unscramble the sentences. So you give them some words and they have to scramble to make the correct sentence. So those are some ideas for form. Okay, so there is a practical idea of how you can structure a grammar lesson according to meaning, use, and form. But as I mentioned at the beginning, there is some disagreement about the order that we should teach these things. Sometimes it might be better to do meaning, form, and use. Okay, I'll leave that up to you. I think as a teacher, it's up to you to make the decision of what's best for your students. Okay, I hope that was really useful, and next time you're teaching grammar and vocabulary, analyze it first in terms of MUF, and then think about how you're going to teach it in terms of MUF. Okay, thank you very much.